Right. Well, today the name Putin is practically synonymous with antagonism towards the West. So we've seen how initially his attitude was one of cooperation and one of being friends and being quite permissive with the whole Iraq business. But then, as time went by, and especially once we get into the 2010s, things really changed. So apart from, well, you just mentioned the 2014, the famous speech in 2014, when by that point things are clearly different. But was there a specific turning point that we can identify? Something that happened.
Yeah, there's definitely I would call it a turning process, right?
Okay.
Because at least from my perspective, and this is not only my opinion, right? Color revolutions played a vital role in showing Russia that the West cannot be trusted.
Yeah.
It was not definitely a show for all of Russia, it was a show for the powers that be in Russia, but they very clearly saw it, that the West cannot be trusted, right? And it started first with the Serbian wars, right, and the Serbian color revolution, and the way in which the US started its bombardment of Serbia in '99, right? From there, we can hop onto the Ukrainian Orange Revolution, which was a show of political power on both sides, right? Which Russia did not win. And it also showed that basically something akin to the collapse of the Soviet Union and akin to the constitutional crisis in the 90s, in 93 in Russia, was possible again in the 2000s because it just happened in Ukraine. And then suddenly, a year later, it happened in Georgia, right? And it started popping out around, and there was an attempt at something like that in Belarus, which was definitely, if Ukraine is always considered the crown jewel of Russian cultural history in a way, right? As this foundational
Kiev.
kind of thing, Kiev, right? Belarus has always been just I don't want to call it the back door or the backyard, right? But it's always been exactly the same thing.
Yes.
Like Belarus was never really perceived by Russia as something apart from it.
Yes.
And so when in Belarus, which is also it's as Slavonic and as Russian speaking almost as Russia, but at the same time it has a firmer hand in power with Lukashenko,
Yes.
right? Openly firm.
Yes.
If it can happen, an attempt at a color revolution, even in
Even
Belarus, then Russia is not safe, right?
Yeah.
And the rhetoric started changing there. And obviously, Valdai was in 2014, right after the start of a true civil war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that was definitely the last possible drop. So before Ukraine, the second Ukraine, right, the Maidan, Euromaidan,
Yes.
there was a possibility to actually find a common language with Russia, and there was some sort of negotiation going on all the time. Even though there were many things that Russia passed that they did not like, but they did not do anything about it, like Libya, for instance, right?
Yes.
Libya was clearly against international regulation. It was done against the recommendation of the UN. It was not a good military operation, and Russia was very adamantly against it. And even that did not change everything as much as Ukraine, right?
Yes.
And for now, Russia can use all of those examples as also horror stories about the West.
So we can see how, with the passing of time, Russia started to feel more and more threatened by events that were happening around the country in its periphery, and in particular from actions taken by the West in supporting these color revolutions and encroaching upon encroaching upon Russia's sphere of influence, not just with the color revolutions, but also with the expansion of NATO.
Of course.
So Russia started to feel like Western influence was coming closer and closer and closer, and that the danger, or well, the risk of destabilization or eventually regime change was becoming more and more of a possibility. And also that, well, the perception was that the West wasn't really playing by the rules, right? And then in response, well, we know what happened in Ukraine and, well, in particular Crimea. And so now the West perceives Russia as being very offensive and the rhetoric as being very belligerent. And, well, obviously the seizing of Crimea is perhaps the greatest representation of the change in Russia's actual, in Russia's actions in the international sphere.
Yes, Russia has decided that it's ready to act, and there's a bunch of reasons. Obviously, NATO is one of them, right? And it ties in very ironically with the oldest of geopolitical
Yes.
thoughts, right?
The security dilemma.
No,
No?
the idea about that of Halford Mackinder about
Yes.
the geographical pivot of history, right? And so the idea there is that in order to limit the power of the Eurasian state, which in this case right now
Is
in
Russia.
our time is
Yes.
Russia, you just have to cut it off from its own peripheral territories one by one.
Yes.
And so that's exactly what's going on with the color revolutions, at least in the Russian perception,
Yes.
right? They see that, 100 years ago, this guy said that the West should do this, and now they're doing it.
And they're doing
No?
it. Yes.
That's a dangerous idea. And so, of course, relationships are ruined, and the problem there is not even, from my perspective, it's obviously a problem in international relations, but think about the actual problem for just the normal people that live in these countries, right?
Yeah.
That is the problem. On the one hand, it's the mimetic warfare that is going on, and the mental viruses that will not only affect this generation of people thinking about the relationship of the two countries, it will affect further down the road the newer generations who will have material to remember about how Russia was aggressive and how you can never trust the Russians, and vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And that's a huge, huge deal.
Yes. Yeah. So Russia tried to establish its place as Russia post-Soviet era, as a world power. It tried by being friends, didn't work. So now it's having to do it by being antagonistic, and so far it's sort of working, right? Because now Russia has this recognition as someone that shouldn't be messed with.
In a way,
Yeah.
of course, it's true, and you can see this in all Latin America, right? Latin America,
Yes.
at least in Mexico specifically, it's very funny how people always think that Vladimir Putin is the kind of president that we should have, or almost always, right?
Yes.
And that Russia, Russia is a superpower, so much more powerful and rich than poor old Mexico, which is, neither of those are really true, right?
No.
Nuclear potential and military potential are the only
Yes.
identifiers there. And of course, that's a huge deal. And the other thing is that, nobody knows what will happen inside of Russia in the next years. People are actually very clearly growing tired of the regime.
Yes.
It's been 20 years now that Putin's regime talks about the horrors of the 10 years that preceded them,
Yes.
right? So it's starting to get ridiculous.
Yes. The story's becoming old.
Yes, it is literally becoming old. People who were born when Putin only just arrived to power are actually in voting age now, right? And that is something that no leader can really overcome easily,
Yes.
right?
So, okay, regardless of the uncertainty of what's going to happen within Russia with Putin's regime, do you think there could be any significant changes in the relationship between the West and Russia in coming years, or perhaps, regardless of Russia's internal situation, the international situation can't really change that quickly? Or what's your perspective on the future?
I think that what we need to start talking about is what is the West? Because I think that the West is splitting, and that's a very important factor. On the one hand, you have the American system. So in the end, it boils down to national systems interacting between each other, right? So the US system, as we know it for a long time now, is based on war. So re-election, right? For some reason, democratic re-election in the US depends on waging war against third world countries. And or as Bill Hicks puts it, bombing brown people, right? That's the solution for any electoral crisis. And so, in this sense, we can see clearly now that the Trump administration is looking for ways to invade something, because there's this old idea about how a war president has to be re-elected, right? So you can see the rhetoric that is going around the Iran problem, which is extremely dangerous to all of us, everywhere, right? Iran is not Iraq. It's a much bigger, more powerful country in
very different
military, economic terms, right? And so seeing how that rhetoric is happening in the US and seeing how there are these huge internal conflicts inside of the US as well, right? And the differences between the states and the general non-homogeneity of the states as they were before, Europe is turning its back on it. And they are realizing that a bad rhetoric from the US towards Russia actually impacts Europe much more than it impacts the US.
Yes,
so is it really worth it to have a war with Russia, or even if it's a verbal war only, right? If the benefit goes to the US president, at least in rhetorical ways, right? Oh, we showed those pesky Russians, no?
Yes.
But all the problems, in the end, come rushing into Europe. So I think that Europe is changing its position right now. The basic idea is that it all depends on the internals of the countries, right? The relationship between them, in the end, depends on the internals.
Yes.
Donald Trump's administration is actually getting flack from the rest of the world, right? And this is to the huge benefit of sort of outsider players like Russia, because now Russia can have a direct dialogue with Europe without the intermission of the US, right?
It's a chance to separate Europe from the
yes,
United States.
Exactly. And so now the real battleground is Europe in that sense, right? But on the other hand, Russia is more closely aligned in the ways in which they do their business with China, which is evident. It's evident in the surveillance, in the judiciary system, in the police apparatus, in the surveillance that they are trying to implement. Well, surveillance is something everybody is trying to implement, but the way in which Russia does it is very similar to the way China does it. So what we are having is actually an Orwellian thing, right? We are actually getting to the point where we have these blocks again that are defined again in terms of some sort of ideology.
Yes.
And
it'll be interesting to observe how the relationship between Russia and China develops, though, because although they are similar and although they are close partners today, we never know how, with China as a rising power, whether that could change.
Yes.
We never know.
Yeah, one issue that Russia has basically is that part of Siberia can always be annexed by China, and there wouldn't be much fuss about it.
Yes, if you look at the centers of power of the two countries, China's center of power is closer to a lot of Russia's far eastern sections than the Russian section center of power.
Absolutely, and it's becoming very clear that China has a much better ability to actually connect things together and to actually build infrastructure and to do the things that it needs to do, right? And Russia is much more relaxed, and the corruption in Russia works differently, and so roads are put down every year, right? They remake the roads because they make them cheaply in the first place, but for a huge price, because bunch of people earn money on that road, right?
Yes.
And that kind of thing, I really doubt it happens in China, at least so openly and on such a level. And so that's a problem. And many people who are talking in Russia about what would happen if Russia fell to pieces, again, they are talking about a possible Chinese intervention in the Far East. There's a lot of Chinese people living there,
Yes.
and the density of the populational density is very, very low. So the resources are huge. China has working camps there. China has access to temporary autonomy. No, that's a completely different. To zones of accelerated development.
Okay.
Something like that is the name. Inside Siberia. That give them basically full access to certain cities and certain territories to extract resources and to put down their enterprises for periods of 50 years. So what happens when the 50 years run out? China's not going to go away from there. No, they build the infrastructure, they're there. So
yes, exactly.
and that's looking closer and closer all the time. If you go to Russia right now in the airport, you can see all the ads are in Chinese in Moscow, right? And in St. Petersburg and many other cities, more than in English.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's that tells you a lot.
That tells you something.
And so that's one thing, right? And well, it's always creepy to talk about China because I think we have to talk about Chinese relationships with other countries more so than the others.
Yes.
China is having a huge impact everywhere. And so this trade war, what can it bring us, right? The new trade war with the US. It can only bring us to the point where we split even more in blocks. And so the attempt of Europe to separate itself from China, from the US, sorry, can also have to do with an attempt at being better friends with China and Russia and other countries, right? So it's something like that.
So lots of trends that we need to be observing, keeping track of.
Yes.
And a lot of questions left unanswered, which we'll find out what the answer is to in the future. And well, fascinating or not. It's a bit ominous to say or not.
Yes, maybe.
But anyway, fascinating talking about the new Cold War and how we got here. 30 years of history explained, put into context. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens, if we get to see what happens. But anyway, thank you very much for this, Kiril Kravchenko. It's been fascinating talking about the new Cold War.
Thanks for the invitation, Geoffrey.
Thank you very much. This is IR Talks, and we'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.